Everyone. This week I want to start talking about poetry. So let me share my screen here and then we'll get started. Hopefully, we don't find poetry nearly as scary as some of the haunted houses and things this year. I'm very excited it's fall. This is my favorite time of year, so it's spooky season. But hopefully, we don't find poetry quite as scary. Um, Hopefully, this unit will be very exciting too. Today, I want to talk just about some basics of poetry. So, today will just serve as an introduction to our discussion on poetry for this unit. And it'll be a pretty broad introduction because we're still just at the beginning. And then we'll look at a couple of sample poems that are some of my favorites. And we'll kind of talk a little bit about each of the aspects of poetry I'm introducing you to today, and we'll go from there. So poetry, of course, is different than prose. However, what characterizes poetry isn't a whole lot different from what characterizes a really effective piece of prose. When we talk about creative nonfiction next, one of the things I'll talk about is lyric essays, for example, which are types of essays that are basically as close to poetry as you can get while still being prose. So poetry works really effectively, I think, as a middle lesson sandwiched between the two types of prose that we'll be focusing on. And as you think about revising your fiction for your final portfolio, one of the things you may want to consider is that some of the things we're learning about poetry could also help you um, really build in some really effective storytelling and fiction as well. Things we'll be talking about today are image, rhythm, rhyme, the line, and connotation. We'll start with image. So when we talk about image here, I mean a clear imagery and description. A lot of poems will have a central image or one object that the entire poem is formed around, and it uses that image as a springboard to discuss something bigger or more meaningful. A poem about a blade of grass, for example, will be about something more than just that blade of grass, but it uses that grass as an image and almost like an anchor for all of the discussion to kind of drop off on. The other goal here is that by using description with as many senses as possible, authentic emotion can be evoked. You can make your readers really feel something. And even though we want to make our readers feel something when we write our prose too, of course, in poetry, it's even more important. Rhythm, for me, is where a poem has a lot of its meaning, and some of this is through line breaks, which we'll talk about more when we talk about the line, but rhythm is music, basically. If you think about really effective musicians, they're often poets. Leonard Cohen, Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen, Tupac Shakur, Kendrick Lamar, Taylor Swift, all of these are musicians who have also been considered poets every bit as much as they've been considered musicians. And that's because of the meaning and the way their lyrics are formed. Poetry is meant to be read out loud. When poetry started, it was not meant to be written down. It was meant to just be read out loud. And now that we're writing it down, there are still ways to play with rhythm, even in print. But poetry is meant to be heard as well as seen, and often the rhythm that you get from a poem comes from reading it out loud. So when you go through the poems in our class, as we move through the poetry unit, listen, read some of them out loud. See if you can find different meaning or better meaning that way. Pacing is an emotion that is created through feeling how fast it's going or how slowly it is. How long are the lines and what does it mean? What does that evolve or evoke in you, and how does it make you feel? Not necessarily by what the words say, but how the rhythm itself makes you feel. A faster paced poem will either feel happy or stressful. A slower paced poem will bring about feelings of reflection or sometimes sorrow and so on. Of course, when you think about poetry, a lot of times we think about rhyming. However, not all poetry rhymes. I'm sure we know this. It doesn't have to. Some of my favorite poems rhyme and some of my favorites don't. Some types of rhymes are in rhyme or line in rhyme, where the end of the line rhymes with either the line before it or there's a pattern where it rhymes with the two lines ahead of it. There's also slant rhyme, which is where it almost rhymes but not quite. Words that are almost there but not quite a full rhyme. There's internal rhyme where maybe the rhyme isn't at the end of the line but in the middle. And then there's something called I rhyme, which is where if you're looking at it on the page, it looks like it rhymes. The words end in a similar sound, but it really doesn't. The sound itself doesn't have the same sound, but the words have the safe endings. So, example, I could be talking about a horse outside of a bar, and I may talk about the hoof of the horse and the roof of the bar. Roof and hoof both are spelled relatively the same. They have the OOF, but it's pronounced differently, but on the page it may look kind of like a rhyme. Of course, there's the line, which is the biggest part of how meaning is evoked in poetry. We create prose pieces through the writing sentences. In poetry, it's through how lines are formed. Often a sentence in a poem inside of a poem will take place over multiple lines where the line breaks in the middle of a poem. A line break is where one line ends before the next one begins. Um, the first and last word on each line usually gets a bigger emphasis than those in the middle, so they're super important. So you want to focus on what attention and pay attention to what word you end your line on. If you don't want to end it on a word that doesn't really have a meaning, like the, if, and something like that, unless there's an intentional meaning for that. The rhythm is created by those line breaks. Short lines with only a few words will have a faster pace. Longer rhymes will have a slower pace, or longer lines will have a slower pace. And often you'll play with different lengths of lines in the same poem, unless it's a more formal type of poetry. By altering your line lengths and your line endings, you can create different rhythms and some pacing. It comes from a careful selection of how meaning is shaped. How am I getting my meaning across in my lines? Every line in a poem should have a purpose. Each word should have a purpose, and if they don't, maybe it doesn't belong there. Missing a slide. There should be a slide here that talks about connotation, so I'll just talk about connotation here. Um, you really want to pay attention to the connotation, the emotional meaning of words. When you're selecting words, what do the words mean emotionally? What will that emotion will that evoke in your reader? And how can I get that emotion across to my readers through paying attention to that kind of definition? So let's take a look at a couple poems. The first one we're going to look at is The Lake Isle of Innisfree by William Butler Yeats. This is one of my favorite poems. I was lucky enough to visit Sligo, Ireland a few years ago to really see where he lived, where he wrote. The pictures on the slide are from various places I saw in Sligo. I was just amazed by how the fact there's poetry everywhere on the sides of buildings. The statue here, is of William Butler Yeats with different poems of his etched and carved into it in front of a museum that's dedicated to his life and his poetry. So anyway, this is one of my favorite poems. I will arise now and I will go. I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree and a small cabin built there of clay and wattles made, 9 bean rows. Will I have there a hive for the honeybee and live alone in the bee loud glade. So here we have some in rhymes, made and glade, free and bee. But as you can see, the lines are a little bit varied. They're not the same length. So that's where the rhythm is coming from. And I will have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the veils of the morning and noon a purple glow, an evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for always night and day, I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore, while I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's gray. I hear it in the deep heart's core. So it starts this really idyllic feeling of this beautiful island, which is now overgrown and uninhabitable. You can't actually step on that island anymore. But it was a place where he spent a lot of his childhood. But you get to the end where he's on the roadway, surrounded by pavements, so he's a long way from that island, and he's kind of heartsick for this happy place he had as a child. The meaning comes through his descriptions. It doesn't say, "Oh, I was really sad." It starts, but he lets us know where he is and is free, but he's very specific with what he sees and what he's hearing, and all of those means things and how it evokes and adds to the meaning of the poem. The last poem I'll show you is another one of my favorites, by Mary Oliver. This is one of her more famous poems and one of her most beautiful poems. Mary Oliver was a nature poet. She was an American poet who was an out lesbian at the time where it wasn't very safe for her to be so. But she was just like, this is me. And a lot of that comes through her poetry, this wanting to live a life authentically, regardless. And she connects that feeling with nature and place to talk about humanity and human life. So let's look at Wild Geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. I really love this poem, and this is a poem that, unlike the Yeats poem, it doesn't have rhyme. Most of Mary Oliver's poetry doesn't rhyme actually, so I wanted to show you two different ways that you could talk about something similar using an idea from nature to talk about humanity. Yeats is talking more about homesickness, and Mary Oliver is talking more about how it feels to be lonely and how it feels to be wrong or to be told you're wrong or not good enough, which I'm sure is something many of us, if not most of us, have felt or experienced at some point in our lives. She starts out by talking about people, but instead of saying you don't have to feel bad, she brings in very clear images of what some feeling bad or not good enough may feel like. And that's walking on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. And then she starts talking about despair, this idea that we all have it, so it's something we can share with each other. But she talks about nature. No matter what, nature's still going, so there's still life out there, and there's something calling to us. She talks about the clear pebbles of rain, which brings a very physical feeling that these huge globs of rain and how they plod against the ground. She talks about the different types of the landscape to bring this feeling of unity. And then she brings wild geese and coming home again and how they announce their place. If you've been around geese, they're not very nice animals. They can be terrifying. They lay their nests wherever they want and they will stand guard and run off even humans that are much larger than them to keep their nests safe. So they can be very scary in that. They announce this is their place. I'm here. This is where I'm laying my eggs. This is where I'm spending the winter. And it's just what it is. And she's saying something similar. She's using this idea of these wild geese as an image. It's saying, what if we were like that? We just said, this is me and I belong here too. They have their place and how the world is calling to announce your place in the family of things. So she's bringing in this feeling of loneliness and solitude to this idea of saying we still belong somewhere. And I think that that's a really beautiful sentiment I think a lot of us need. But I think if she said it through prose, it probably wouldn't be as effective. I mean, maybe it could be, but I think this is a situation where poetry really helps. She uses line breaks much differently than Yeats. She doesn't have those separate stanzas where it's four lines, then in white space. Everything in her poem is one stanza. The feeling comes from rhythm, which is a little bit slower because the rhyme or lack of rhyme. Some of the sentences go over a line or two, so it's this idea that brings you this feeling of like melodic, almost like meditation. So those are some things to think about when you start writing your own poetry. Um, I hope you enjoy really getting into poetry. If you're afraid of it, I know sometimes poetry can feel a little intimidating. I'm not gonna lie, it intimidates me too. Sometimes when I start writing it, I have a really hard time getting started. But also keep in mind, no matter what type of writing you really want to focus on, whatever type that all the genres we're exploring this semester, let's say you leave this class and you're like, I only want to write fiction, or I only want to write memoir, or I only want to write poetry. The techniques we learn from each different genre of writing can easily be transferred to the other kinds. The rhythm and the focus on image from poetry can make for some really beautiful short stories or personal essays. The openness and bravery that comes from writing strong personal essays can make its way into writing strong fiction, strong characters for fiction, or some really good confessional types of poetry. There's a lot of different types of poetry out there, and we'll look at as many different ones as I can possibly find and fit into our time together. And if there's anything at all that you want to learn from poetry, please let me know and I'll fit it in. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I look forward to reading your writing. Happy writing.